Okay, so we've hit the magic number. It's 1 o'clock, and it's time for the Florida Master Gardener webinar. And I'm really excited today because we have Dr. Lori Trenholm, and she is going to be talking to us on giving us a turf update, which a lot of us need. We thought it was a really timely time to do this. But first, I have a couple of announcements to make. We have a good slate of webinars coming up. The next class is going to be March 29th at 1 o'clock, and it's going to be on tomatoes. And Larry Williams has a terrific talk on growing tomatoes. And then we've got a nice lineup for you. And just a reminder that the webinars do live on the Florida Master Gardener website. So you can see on this web page here that I clipped from the Florida Master Gardener website, the recent webinar that we had with Jarrett Daniels and Sam Epstein. There is a recording of it there, so if you missed that one, you can go back and grab it. And then we will do the same. Lori already has her presentation notes up on the website, so if you want to go check those out. And then this is where the recorded webinar will be later. Probably be up by next week. So the Epcot Flower and Garden Festival kicks off next week. We're going to be there from the first weekend of March all the way till almost the last weekend of May. We still have openings to work the Master Gardener information booth, so check with your coordinators if you haven't yet signed up. We will be in an air-conditioned space, and we will be answering questions from the folks who are attending the Flower and Garden Festival. It's always a really good time. We've got some dates for you all to save. June 26th and 27th is the Master Gardener Leadership School, and this is going to be open to 2 or 3 selected Master Gardeners. The coordinators pick the leaders that they want to attend the leadership school. So if you want to do that, you can work with your coordinator to go into that. And then the regional Master Gardener conferences are going to be coming up for 2018, and Volusia County has already got their date set at September 28th, and I think Southwest was looking at October 26th. I'm not positive on that one yet. Northwest is going to be in the Fort Walton Beach or Walton County area, but they don't have their date locked down. But a real exciting date for Lori Trenholm and I is October 16th is going to be our Master Gardener Turfgrass Field Day, which is a fantastic day of learning. So stay tuned for more of that. But if you want to hold on to October 16th, it's going to be our Turfgrass Field Day. And then October 27th through November 5th, the Master Gardener Workshop, Food Systems of Southern Italy. So if you're interested in going to Southern Italy, the deposits are due April 15th, and we already have 15 people signed up. So it's going to be a really excellent trip. So we want to welcome Dr. Lori Trenholm today. She is the University of Florida IFAS Extension Turf Specialist. She's done marvelous work in the turfgrass world for us here in Florida, and she's certainly our go-to person for any kind of grass questions. And I'm going to stop sharing now. And Lori, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Wendy. Let's see if I can get this screen to share here. Are you seeing my presentation?
Not yet.
Oh, it might be a good thing that Wendy and I don't work far from one another.
Okay. So Lori, when you hit share screen, do you get a, it says it's, okay, there you go.
We got it? Okay.
Yeah.
Are you looking at the picture of the really nice lawn and the really nice brick house, or are you looking at sort of a jumbled, messy title slide?
I'm looking at a jumbled, messy title slide.
Okay. Well, picture that there's a really nice lawn and landscape behind turfgrass species and cultivar selection. And hey, everybody, it's great to be here with you today. I'm really glad to be presenting this to you guys. I know you all get a lot of questions on turfgrass, and sometimes they're not the easiest ones to answer. Wendy asked me to concentrate on selection, right plant, right place, of course, and fertilization, and we'll try and touch on a few of the other basic cultural practices as well. Sometimes if we just go over some of these basics, once a year or once every other year or something, you become more familiar with them. This may be basic for some of you if you've been through one of my Master Gardener turf trainings before, but I bet you that everybody's going to pick up at least a couple of new things today. So we'll start with selection, and we'll just go in alphabetical order here. So we'll start with Bahia grass. And of course, as you know, Bahia grass grows by underground stems, which are called rhizomes. It does not have stolons above ground. It grows sort of in bunches, which means because it doesn't have the stolons, it doesn't form that carpet-like look. But if it's used on a roadside or in a lawn or somewhere, and you're doing a drive-by and it's getting rainfall, it'll look pretty good, won't it? It's just when you go and stand in the grass and look down at it, you can see that there's kind of some open gaps there. And that's really just Bahia grass. You can always sow in a little more seed and get it to dense up somewhat, but that's sort of just its nature. So there's really not a lot you can do about that necessarily. And it likes fairly acidic soils. It's not going to want to grow in a high pH situation, and it does really well in our sandy soils. It does have good drought tolerance. That's probably its main claim to fame. It can go for extended periods without getting any water. It will go into a drought-induced dormancy, but then once it starts getting that rainfall, it does green back up. The only problem is that you can lose some of the density that way. And of course, we know that in Florida, we have a very, very viral weed seed bank in the soil. So wherever those weed seeds see an opportunity, they are going to pop up. So sometimes that can happen in Bahia grass after it's gone through a drought-induced stress. Low fertilization requirements. Some of you know this, but I have a Bahia grass lawn at my house. I'm out in the country. I don't have an irrigation system, and I haven't fertilized that lawn in years. And it probably looks like it. It could look a little bit better, but I'm not that worried about it. The grass is healthy, and maybe this will be the year I'll fertilize it. I don't know. You can see here this picture is taken over by the entomology building, and that's one of what I was talking about earlier, those drive-by shots where it can look pretty good actually. Bahia grass is also generally low maintenance grass. Of course, you're going to want to mow it pretty regularly during the summer months because it puts up those annoying seed heads. But other than that, it doesn't need a whole lot. Disease, insects, really low occurrences there. Although I did have some mole crickets in my Bahia last summer, and I realized that after a while that was probably because once we started getting summer rains, whenever it was, sometime mid-June or whenever, we had a pretty wet summer. And of course, they like it wet. Also, high rates of nitrogen, which are totally unnecessary in Bahia grass, but if you are using high rates of nitrogen, that can also induce some mole cricket problems. Again, sandy, acidic, and fertile soils, and it can reestablish itself from seed. If you just say, I'm not mowing these seed heads during the summer months and let the seed drop to the ground, it'll take about 3.5 weeks, and you might get a little bit more growth from that, but that's who's going to want to go for 3 or 4 weeks in the summer without mowing your Bahia grass? I mean, who knows what could be crawling around underneath your feet. So Bahia grass, of course, is not perfect, and those seed heads are probably one of its biggest disadvantages, especially the cultivar Pensacola, which is pretty prolific in seeding. And it's those long days of summer that really bring on that seed head production. The open growth that we talked about a few minutes ago, that does allow for weed competition to happen, talked about the mole crickets. The stems that those seed heads sit on are very hard. They're very sclerified and lignified, and they will wear your mower blades out. So if you're mowing weekly during the summer months, you're probably going to want to sharpen those mower blades maybe twice a year, maybe midway through the summer and then at the end of basically the mowing season. And as you can see here, if you're going to keep using the same path with vehicle or heavy foot traffic, it's just not going to stand up to the traffic. And there's really nothing, again, you can do about that. That's just the nature of the grass. So that's kind of Bahia in a nutshell. One more anecdote I'll pass on about it is a couple of years I had a call from a county agent, and there was some issue of disease on Bahia grass, suspected disease, and this was actually on a racetrack, an equine racetrack. And so I thought, how could we have disease on Bahia? I don't think I've ever seen that before. But we went down and took a look, and sure enough, it was wintertime. This was early December or late December. It was actually right before Christmas break. And there were these large patches of yellow grass, and it did turn out to be large patch. And Dr. Harmon confirmed that. And even he was kind of surprised to see it on Bahia grass, but he said the conditions this year just happened to be really conducive to it. So even some of these grasses where I say, it has very few pest problems, things can occur, and a lot of times the environmental conditions just make that happen. So moving on to centipede grass, that's one that we think of as being used throughout the Panhandle, North Florida, up in some other southern states. You'll see it if you go further north. And it's another low input type of grass, very low maintenance. It likes clay soils, and it also likes low pH like the Bahia grass, but it will do real well in those clay soils, not that it couldn't grow well in sand. It has very few insect pests, does have one major disease pest, and that is take-all root rot, or as we call it, centipede grass decline. If it's over-fertilized and overwatered, that really sets it up. It's very susceptible, and if that fungal pathogen is out there, it's probably going to hit it, and you're going to have centipede grass decline. So real important if you get questions about how often people should fertilize their centipede grass, you really want to instill some caution in them so that they're not applying too much nitrogen fertilizer. One thing about centipede grass that's a complete opposite of Bahia grass is it does not have rhizomes, but it does have the above ground stolons. So that means that if you do something that kills or injures the shoot system of this grass, you may have just killed all or a number of the growing points, because those stolons have the nodes, and those are the sites of most of the new growth that we get on these grasses that don't have rhizomes. So you have to be real careful about that. But other than that, it's a pretty easy grass to maintain. Low mowing height, generally about an inch, inch and a half. Reduced mowing needs because of that. And it also reduced fertilization as with Bahia grass. And it can go fairly well without irrigation. But because it doesn't have those rhizomes, it makes it a little bit more susceptible to some of those types of stresses. So just keep that in mind. But overall, a fairly easy grass. So now we get into, of course, the one that gets all of the attention about being so bad, not a good grass. It uses way too much water. Well, all right, let's stop right there. The grass isn't going out and demanding water. People are putting too much water on, and we know this happens over and over again all over the state. People over irrigate, and I will come out and say that that probably causes the demise of more lawns in the state of Florida than any other single thing. It certainly is a key factor in it. But St. Augustine grass, it does form a nice backdrop for our landscapes. It can tolerate a little bit of shade, as we see in this one shaded landscape. It's just that people, if they're from up north, they tell me that's what up home we used to call crabgrass. And they just don't like it because it does have kind of coarse, dense leaf blades. It doesn't feel as good as some of the finer bladed grasses to walk barefoot in, but it does have a lot of advantages. So let's go through some of those. It does have, by and large, the best shade tolerance of any of our warm season grass species, but there's a lot of variation within the species. Of course, it's the dwarf cultivars, which would be primarily Seville and Delmar these days, that have the best shade tolerance. Next would be most likely bitter blue, and then they kind of fall into a clump in the middle with the other standard types of palmetto, classic, Delta shade, and then Floratam kind of being at the bottom of the ladder when it comes to shade tolerance. However, it's real important to understand that shade tolerance means that they still have to have X number of hours or integrals of light throughout the day, of sunlight. And generally for the dwarfs, they're going to want to have 4 to 6 hours of sunlight throughout the day. Some of that can be a little bit dappled, so the grasses can typically grow well if they're at the perimeter of the big old oak tree, but you try and grow those grasses up to the base of that big old oak tree with a 50-foot diameter, and that is not going to be sustainable. The grasses are not going to survive. Salinity tolerance is pretty good too. So salinity tolerance, of course, if you're in a coastal area, that might be important if you're real close to the water, or where you have reclaimed water being used. A lot of times that has higher salinity than what we would have otherwise. Tolerates a wide range of soil pH, whereas the first two grasses we talked about like it acidic, and they probably won't do real well above, let's say, a pH of about 6.5. You know, they're comfortable down in the mid fives, really. St. Augustine grass can grow from mid or preferably high fives maybe, up to the low sevens. Once we start getting up above that, any of our grasses can be subject to micronutrient deficiencies. That can easily be alleviated through micronutrient application, but St. Augustine grass can thrive in a wide range of diverse climates and soils throughout the entire state of Florida. It establishes pretty quickly, and I get asked a lot of time, what is the best time of year to establish a new lawn? So there are a lot of different ways you can look at this, and probably a lot of different turfgrass scientists might give you different answers. Doesn't mean that any one person's right or wrong, it's just the way it is. But in general, what I like to think of is, when is the grass physiologically best adapted to grow? And that would be coming up in the springtime here. They start growing in response to not only the warmer temperatures, but also the longer day lengths. And so you do see that growth spurt begin. And depending on where you are in the state, it might be March, it might be April. If it's a real late winter and we have late frosts or freezes, it might be later than that. But St. Augustine grass establishes and comes out of winter dormancy as well pretty well during that period. Now, one thing is that it can be dry during that time period, so you've got to make sure that you're able to supply adequate irrigation water during the establishment phase, because you do require more frequent irrigations when you're establishing newly planted sod. You could also take advantage of the summer rains to plant a new lawn, or wait until things cool down a little bit in the fall, but that would not be my druthers, the fall planting. And certainly if you have freezes, if you're in the northern part of the state, or even the Gainesville area, or a little bit further south, wintertime might not be good, just because it makes it a little harder to get those roots to establish. So some of the advantages, finishing those up, it's kind of the standard, you know, that's been our go-to grass for use in Florida. And for the most part, we know how to manage it. Now, that varies a little bit. There are a lot of new residents who come in and know absolutely nothing about how to manage it or anything else in our Florida landscapes. And that's where we come in to provide them with those answers. Of course, St. Augustine grass is starting to be displaced, and that displacer is zoysia grass predominantly, especially Empire, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So disadvantages of St. Augustine grass. Like centipede grass, it only grows by stolons, so it has no underground growing points. You do have what's called the crown tissue right at the base of the soil and air interface, and that has some meristematic growing points on it. But if you spray an herbicide that says do not use if temperatures exceed 85 or 90 degrees or whatever the label may say, and it's 95, and you spray that herbicide, you could very likely injure or even kill a large number of the growing points on St. Augustine grass, and that's why those labels say that. If you come in and scalp St. Augustine grass, same thing could happen. So that's why it makes it a little bit weaker grass and gives it a little bit of a disadvantage. It does require water during drought. It can't go for prolonged periods. In most situations, especially if you're in full sand, full sun, maybe you've got a westward slope, and any waters that you do apply or rainwater that you might get might drain off and not be able to reach the roots of a big part of the lawn. So it generally is going to need some water, but again, I will say that generally St. Augustine grass or any of our lawn grasses are over irrigated rather than irrigated correctly or under irrigated. But you know, St. Augustine grass and zoysia grass, they approach drought differently. And St. Augustine grass, if it's going into a drought phase, it just keeps on going and going and going. And all of a sudden it realizes it has no water, it's really desiccated, and it just can't go on anymore. And then it goes into a deep depression, and that's it for a while. It might recover, it might not at that point. Zoysia grass, on the other hand, will sort of take its time and start going into a shutting down mechanism early on. And you'll see that as a firing or browning of the leaf tissue. And so it enters into this drought-induced dormancy early. And that's a protective measure because it's shutting down metabolically, physiologically, and it's preserving itself to get through a drought that who knows how long it's going to last. So that's what they do differently. Wear tolerance, not good in St. Augustine grass. Like we mentioned with Bahia, that's just the way the grass is. And there's really nothing you can do about it. I think we see more of it in St. Augustine grass because it is widely used in the majority of home lawns. And so the dog takes the same track around the house every day. It's going to be worn out there, but you know, that's again just the way it is. Chinch bugs are still rearing their ugly heads. Of course, that's not the only insect pest that bothers it, but that's the predominant one. You know, rotation of the insecticides is really, really important in controlling that and trying to keep the resistance to the chemicals out of the chinch bug population. And basic good cultural practices will always reduce pest populations. Herbicides for grassy weed control are problematic. Best bet is pre-emergence controls, where the herbicides are applied prior to the weed seeds germinating. Crabgrass is a big problem in a lot of St. Augustine grass lawns. And if you're in South Florida, a pre-emergence application should be done in early February, in Central Florida, mid-February, and in North Florida, late February. And that will provide it'll provide some good control. There are some herbicides that you can use for grassy weed control, but they're more likely to be found in the commercial pesticide market. Not that people can't go to whatever the John Deeres are called now. I'm drawing a blank on that, but you guys know what I'm talking about. They can go there and buy, but most homeowners aren't going to do that. And sometimes on the pre-emergence, you do have to follow up with a repeat application. I think it's like 8 or 10 weeks later, but it probably varies a little bit depending on the labels. And, you know, St. Augustine grass takes some work. I mean, if you want any type of a nice landscape, it does take some work. Now, some of you are probably real familiar with this next thing that we're going to talk about here. This is relatively new, and this is sugarcane mosaic virus. This is what it starts out looking like. You can see that chlorotic mottling on these leaf blades. And, you know, if I looked at this before I ever heard the term sugarcane mosaic virus and knew that it was a problem in St. Augustine grass, I would have looked at this and said, that's probably a micronutrient deficiency, but it's not. So if you see something that looks like this, if anyone brings you a sample, suspect sugarcane mosaic virus, I would send a sample to Dr. Harmon, or at least send him a picture. He may or may not be able to tell from that. But what happens, there have been outbreaks in multiple counties around the state, but it's real random. Started in West Palm Beach, of course, near where they grow sugarcane mosaic, or near where they grow sugarcane. And then it was next identified in Pinellas County, and then it kind of jumped up to parts of Northeast Florida. Dr. Harmon's studying this. He's got some good research funding to learn everything he can about this virus, and he's got a lot of information so far. And one thing he's found is that the problem where you lose the lawns is occurring thus far only in Floritam. It can also affect bitter blue and palmetto and perhaps other cultivars as well, but they will generally not die from the disease the way Floratam will. No chemical treatments are available, and this is ultimately what you wind up with. So there may be some of these green areas here that you can see. A lot of those are weeds. There may be a few sprigs of grass still there, but basically this lawn is pretty much toast. If you have a client that does have this and you get a confirmation from Dr. Harmon on that, best thing to do is replace it. You can go with one of the other St. Augustine grass cultivars, but that may be a little too dicey for some folks, and they may want to go with Empire zoysia grass or with something different. But it's really kind of a complex critter, and there's still a lot that we need to learn about it. So Floratam's the predominant St. Augustine grass. This is one of the group of St. Augustines that we call the standards. They have the denser, more coarse leaf blades. They grow at a taller height, and they need to be mowed at 3.5 to 4 inches. They have kind of bigger stolons too, and that's in contrast to the dwarfs, which would be mowed at a lower height, smaller leaf blades, smaller stolons, etc. Palmetto is a little bit of an in-between those two. It has a lighter green coloration and shorter growth than the other standard types. I don't know that it necessarily has excellent drought, shade, or cold tolerance. I was doing a commercial program yesterday at a Apopka, and one gentleman told me he had it in his backyard, which was pretty heavily shaded, and he was really happy with it. So we do see it being used, and with this sugarcane mosaic, maybe we'll start seeing an increase in other cultivars of St. Augustine grass and less Floratam. That'd be a big change for the sod industry. And then we have our dwarfs, Delmar and Seville. 2 to 2.5 inch mowing height, best shade tolerance, but still 4 to 6 hours of sun daily. And your cold tolerance will be best in Delmar if you're in a northern area of the state. Okay, so here's the picture I was looking for on the very first slide. I'd love to be able to tell you that's my home and my lawn because I'd be very proud of it then. It's not, but this is zoysia grass. This is Empire zoysia grass, and it's really taken over a good share of the market from St. Augustine grass. It's becoming very widely used, and it's very popular. People like it. It's got finer leaf blades than St. Augustine grasses in general, and it's got, again, its problems, but it's not without a lot of merit as well. Now, we never really used to use zoysias much until maybe 20 years ago with the onset of Empire. Actually, the older zoysias, they grow up north. They'll grow north of the transition zone, and some of you may have grown up with them if you are in that area, Indiana, Delaware, through there. They do fine. You put them down here south of the transition zone, they do terrible. Nematodes are a problem, and that's always been a problem with some of our grasses in Florida. Disease, coarse leaf texture, etc., really slow to grow, really slow. But these newer zoysias, they establish much more quickly. They still are a little slower growing than some of the other species, although in summer, those stolons will extend into the neighbor's Floratam lawn without hesitation. Now, there are some nematode problems with Empire and the other zoysias that are available. Empire is the lion's share of the zoysia market, though, so that's why I tend to use Empire and zoysia somewhat interchangeably. That's actually not correct to do that, but I do kind of find myself doing it. So you do see some nematode issues, but it's not as damaging as in some of the other cultivars. I guess the biggest probably cultural change that we need to adapt to with these zoysias is probably disease susceptibility, particularly large patch. Large patch is mostly prevalent during the cooler months, starting in the fall, again, depending on your location in the state, throughout the winter and into spring. and you can really induce it with excess water and excess nitrogen. They also tend to become thatchier. In general, your finer bladed grasses will become thatchier more quickly than your larger floratam type growers. It's just sort of the nature. So, you know, I've been telling the commercial guys for a couple decades now that they need to be thinking about thatch management, and they can't just think about aeration when they're talking about that, because that really is used to fix the soil when you have compacted soils. But verticutting is something that's very, very seldom done. And it's really hard to go in and scalp St. Augustine grass, as we talked about a few minutes ago. Okay, just pretend you don't see this here for a minute. There we go. All right, just a couple more shots of the zoysia grass. Came out in 1999. I think we've talked about this. Most of these bullet points, it does have slow spring green up. And so if you have a client who has zoysia grass and there are floratam lawns on the others, on both other sides of them, those floratams will be greening up and growing before the empire will. And so their inclination is to go out with another application of fertilizer or call their pest control company and say, you need to come fertilize again, my lawn's not greening up. But then, you know, are you setting it up for that large patch disease? And it seems to have consistently good performance throughout Florida. Salinity tolerance, in general, zoysias have fairly good salinity tolerance, about as good as St. Augustine grass probably. And I've got reduced maintenance zoysia grass. Some people think it's a little more work than St. Augustine grass. I think it's 6 half dozen. It's kind of, you know, all in how you tend to look at things. It grows low, it grows dense, its mowing height should be about 2 inches, and it's very responsive to nitrogen. And what I mean by that is our typical application rate of 1 pound of N per 1,000 square feet. That's kind of been our mantra for years now for fertilizing our lawn grasses. With zoysia grass, you can, in most situations, every, you know, environment, site might be a little bit different, but in general, you can apply less than 1 pound and get just as good a response as you would on a floratam lawn with the 1 pound of nitrogen. And it needs less nitrogen than St. Augustine grass does. I mentioned earlier that its shade tolerance is probably pretty much on par with floratam. Its main insect pest is the hunting billbug, although you certainly find caterpillars and other things bothering it. Tuttle mealybug is becoming more widely seen in the zoysia grasses, and it's causing a lot of damage. That large patch definitely is an issue. Tends to get thatchy, and we talked about nematodes. So that's kind of it on the grasses. The selection, right plant, right place is real important. Oh, and Empire can handle a pretty good range of pH too. So it's similar to the St. Augustine grass in that respect. One thing I want to mention on zoysia grass, you hear quite frequently that it needs less water than St. Augustine grass. If you hear that, don't believe it. It's not true. They both need about the same amount of water to stay green and healthy. It's just in how they approach the drought. So it can generally get through a drought better than St. Augustine grass will, but less nitrogen, not really less water. All right, so let's talk about fertilization. I don't know how many of you guys have taught or sat through the GIBMP classes. Probably a good number of you have, but you know, it comes back to those basics. That's kind of where we need to be getting people to go to think about what they're doing when they're fertilizing, the possible consequences, especially if they're near a water body, that there could be. You know, environmental consequences, as well as the consequences of, is my lawn going to be healthy, or am I going to hurt it by applying the fertilizer improperly? So it comes down to a lot of these basics, and most of these are actually more environmentally oriented, and the right application amounts and application timings are geared towards sustaining the health of your lawn. Keep the fertilizer off impervious surfaces. Maintain a 10-foot buffer zone around water bodies. Now, if you've been through the GIBMPs or you teach it, we say 3 feet. That's for professionals using a spreader with a deflector shield. Technically, if a homeowner had a spreader with a deflector shield and was using it properly, they could also do a 3-foot buffer zone. But for most homeowners, it's easier to err on the side of caution. Apply only the correct amount. Know your pH and plant available nutrient concentrations in the soil. Another thing, and if you've heard Dr. Shattuck's talk, you'll hear him talk about this, and in my mind, this is huge also. It's important to know the soil physical properties as well as the chemical properties. You know, is it compacted? What's the bulk density? What's the makeup, the texture of the soil? If you know all those things, you're going to be better able to use the correct landscape plants and tools to maintain those plants, including the turf, and keep them healthy. So it's really important to know that. And if you've got compacted soils, that's a whole nother issue. And maybe I or someone else will come back and talk to you about that someday, because we see a lot of those problems in these large-scale developments like the Villages, a lot of places down in Southwest Florida. And it really does become problematic. We've done a good job of reducing phosphorus use in general. We can sometimes get into some phosphorus deficiencies though, and it's a good idea to know how much plant available phosphorus is in your soil. We only want to fertilize during the growing season. A lot of people don't realize that our warm season grasses will actually lose 50 to 60% of their root system during the winter months. Not so much if you're in South Florida, but if you're in Central or North Florida, you can definitely see that. It's just like a mirror image below ground of what we see with the shoot system above ground during the winter versus the summer months. So you don't have the root mass to take up the fertilizer. If the grass is in dormancy, it's not going to use it anyways. And so what's going to happen to those nutrients? Well, they're not going to stick around in the soil, because nitrate nitrogen doesn't stick around in the soil. It will run off, it will leach, or maybe it volatilizes before it gets worked into the soil. Now, you want to irrigate your fertilizer in with about 1/4 inch of water if you're able to. This can be real challenging for commercial folks to do, because the irrigation controller is usually in the garage, and that might be locked when they're there. So that can be problematic. You can get the volatilization into the air as a gas of the nitrogen. You can burn the leaf tissue. However, with more of the slow release nitrogen sources and controlled release that are being used these days, it's less apt to be problematic, but it should be irrigated in when possible with 1/4 inch of water. Get that fertilizer down to the root zone where it can most effectively be taken up. So again, sweep up those fertilizer spills. Clippings should not be left on the roadway. That's either gonna get washed down the storm drain with the next irrigation event or with rainfall, and so that's going to lead to non-point source pollution. Okay, don't know where that came from. Okay, so why do we want to fertilize anyways? Well, just like we need nutrients, our lawns need nutrients also. And what they can't get from the soil, they may need to have in small amounts from fertilizer. When we apply a nitrogen fertilizer, we get 2 responses. The grasses grow and they turn green. And so you want to fertilize to the point where you're promoting healthy growth during the growing season, but not over fertilizing. And I think that's a lot of times where people get tangled up. If you don't fertilize enough, what's going to happen? In any of these grasses, we talked about it specifically with Bahia, but it can happen with any of them. You're going to have gaps or voids in the grass, and those opportunistic weeds are going to come on up. Also, what about stormwater runoff? Holding the soil in place. Those are a couple of the key things that our grasses do in the urban environment. And so if the lawn is not properly fertilized and we can't do that as well, then the grass isn't able to do its job, but it doesn't mean over-fertilized by any stretch. So when do we want to fertilize? It does depend on where you are in the state, but for most of our recommendations for annual nitrogen fertilization rates, it's going to be 1 to 4 times a year. You want to fertilize in the spring. Now, if you have Bahia or centipede, you may skip a year now and then, but generally you're going to want to do, and most homeowners will do at least once a year. In the spring when growth begins and when the danger of frost is over. So in Central Florida, early April, and just because it's been a very warm February, January was very cold, and don't think that those cold temperatures can't sneak back up on us again in March. You guys know that. You've been doing horticulture, some of you, for a long time, and you know what it's like here in Florida. So wait until after the danger of frost is past, and that's usually going to be sometime in April. If you're in North Florida, wait until about mid-April or so, I would say. In the summer, many of you can't apply nitrogen or phosphorus fertilizer in the summer, and that's okay. But we do recommend that when you do that first spring fertilization, make it a controlled release fertilizer that can keep releasing the nitrogen for maybe up to 4 months long. And so that way you should be able to hopefully get through that ban period. It's important to remember, though, that most of the controlled release products, the release rate is going to vary between different products, and it's very dependent on temperature. So if we're having mid-90, high 90-degree days for a number of days, you're going to get a lot more of that nitrogen releasing quickly, and where it might be a 4-month product under some conditions, it might only last for 2.5 or 3 months under those very, very hot conditions. If you want to go out and do another fertilization in the fall, that's a time to really think about potassium, because potassium is really beneficial to turfgrass when it's under any type of stress. And if we go through a winter where we're going freezing, warm up, freezing, warm up, freezing, warm up, this year so far, those have been in monthly increments, but you know, sometimes 1 week can be nice, the next week can freeze, and we can do that all winter long. So that kind of makes the grass just do a little bit better under those types of conditions. And again, do not fertilize dormant grass. And if you're in South Florida, your grasses slow down their growth, because remember, the day length is important also, but they may keep growing in green, but they have slowed that growth down just because the day lengths are shorter. But we still say you can fertilize year-round if you want to in South Florida. And here's a schematic of what I was just talking about. Winter, spring, so here we are right about here right now. Temperatures, you know, are pretty nice. Days are getting longer, thank goodness. And so we're starting to see a little more growth. I know I was seeing more growth in my yard and thinking, well, maybe I have to mow again. But then I realized that was just weeds anyways coming in. So it didn't really matter. But look what happens with the root system. Look how short it can be during the summer months. And the further south you go in the state, the less dramatic this will be. Your curve might be, you know, down like this if you're in South Florida. And so, you know, here we are, middle of summertime, with that massive, deep root system. And that's the time that the grass can optimally take up the fertilizer. And ironically, it's the time when many people cannot fertilize their grasses. So let's talk about the nitrogen sources, soluble versus slow release nitrogen. I know there's a lot of confusion over this and sometimes some misunderstanding. So we'll start by talking about the soluble nitrogen sources. Now, you really technically cannot walk into a retail store and buy a bag of soluble nitrogen that will say it's for use on lawns. That's not allowed by the DAX Urban Turf Fertilizer labeling rule. However, you could walk in and probably find a bag of all-soluble nitrogen for something else, and who's to say you couldn't apply it to your lawn? So people can get around most anything if they want to. But you do see it still widely used by athletic turf, golf courses, because they need to be able to repair damage from traffic and other things pretty quickly, and that gives them that quick response. Quickly, that nitrogen's released quickly, but it usually only lasts for about 30 days or so. Now, if you do not have a healthy, actively growing turf system, the soluble nitrogen sources are more likely to leach, especially if they're over applied or followed by excess irrigation or rainfall. But if you have a healthy, actively growing turf, the nitrogen is applied at the IFAS recommended rates, watered in correctly, no huge monsoons coming 4 hours later. The leaching rates are very, very low, and statistically, our long-term leaching study that we did found no difference in nitrate leaching between soluble and the controlled release or slow release nitrogen sources on most evaluation dates. Slow release nitrogen sources. So they use different types of technology to release the nitrogen over time. Many of them have coatings that do that. Sulfur-coated urea, example from the 1940s. That was the slow release mechanism. Now we have polymer coats. These are proprietary. They will vary somewhat in composition and density between manufacturers and between different lines within one manufacturer's pool of products. So the way that, and some of the nitrogen in some of the sources like ureaform, IBDU, etc., those are released when chemical bonds are broken, basically. So the release rate at which the nitrogen is released is tied to whatever technology you use. Many of them will give you a response for 60 or 90 days. They do have the 4-month products now, but they may not last during those really high temperature times. When you apply these products, you'll see less growth, less green surge right after you apply it, but you'll get a more subtle response to the nitrogen, and it will last longer, presumably. They are more expensive, but they are very good quality. And if you are in Central or North Florida, you want to be very cautious about applying a controlled release product with a long response time, like a 4-month product, and in some cases even a 2 or 3-month product in the fall. You don't want to apply them then because you could potentially still be releasing nitrogen during the winter months, and you don't have the root system in many cases to take it up. So that's Central and North Florida. Again, not so much of an issue in North Florida. And again, our multi-year research shows that there's no difference in the amount of nitrate N leach due to N source when applied to healthy and actively growing turf. And a lot of people will look at me and say, that's counterintuitive, you've got that wrong, it's bad science. And I'll say, you're leaving out the dynamic of the turf. Remember, you've got the filter above ground and the filter below ground, and that's what makes turf such a good sponge. That's what allows it to filter stormwater runoff and keep stuff from leaching through the soil into our aquifer, and that is what makes the difference. Now, most of the counties who have fertilizer ordinances, they do, many of them, not all, but many stipulate that you have to have X amount of slow release nitrogen in the mix. And for many of the commercial guys, that's 50%. Many of the products that you see, you'll find 50% slow release nitrogen, and that's fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with applying those products. Might be a little more expensive, but you might not have to do it so often and your lawn might look better. So here are our current nitrogen recommendations, and we base our fertilization recommendations for turfgrass on pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. Typically, you'll be applying 1 pound of N per 1,000 square feet with each application. So for North Florida, for St. Augustine grass, where we say 2 to 4 pounds of N a year, that would mean 2 to 4 applications. If you apply once and you correctly apply it at 1 pound, then you're applying 1 pound. That may be enough for some soils. Central Florida, the rate is 2 to 5, and South Florida, it's 4 to 6, based on the idea that people are fertilizing year-round. I don't think you'll find homeowners out there applying fertilizer that often themselves, but that's kind of for the commercial side of things. Okay, now these other species recommendations have all recently changed. I believe all of these changes have been made in EDIS. I know it has for the zoysia grass because that was changed a couple of years ago. The bahia grass and the centipede have just very recently been changed. Actually, it was last fall. So for zoysia grass, for North Florida, 2 to 3 pounds a year, Central 2 to 4, and South Florida 2.5 to 4.5. We just tried to throw in something a little tricky, I guess, there. And these recommendations that have all changed, they're based on both nitrate leaching data, and we have millions of data points in this research, and turf quality, and that equates to turf health. So that's zoysia grass. Bahia grass, these are brand new recommendations. Again, this should be changed in EDIS by now. North and Central Florida, 1 to 3 pounds a year, and South Florida, 1 to 4 pounds a year. For bahia grass, these top numbers here, they're the same as they were before, but the bottom numbers have all been decreased based on the research. And so there you see it. So that would kind of imply that 1 pound of nitrogen, 1 application of fertilizer a year on Bahia grass, and that might be fine. Or you could be my lawn, and you could get it every once in a blue moon, basically. Okay, centipede grass, big changes for centipede grass. Our lowest number, and these bottom numbers now are based on regression analysis when we were doing this statistical analysis, and it showed that 0.4 pounds, regardless of where you were in the state, could potentially provide a sufficiently good quality, healthy centipede grass lawn. So North Florida 0.4 to 2, Central and South Florida 0.4 to 3. And what can be more confusing than a 0.4 when we base our per application recommendations on 1 pound? So I would say take the 1 pound rate and cut that in half. It's probably too complicated for a lot of homeowners to figure out how to do just 40% of that. Maybe not. Maybe I'm underestimating them. Did I just go by one there? No, then we did that one. Okay, so let's talk about some of these other cultural practices real quickly. How frequently to water. Again, we've all seen it. Homeowners get this wrong all the time. And there's no one number for that. I mean, it's going to vary based on season, type of soil. The more organic matter, the more loam you've got in there, the less you're going to need to water. The amount of shade, definitely a huge factor. How deep are your roots? And that's going to be based a little bit on what time of year is it. Insects or other pests or other stresses that might make your lawn desiccate a little bit more quickly. So how frequently to water, no single answer. You can maybe kind of narrow in on, and I don't have location in the state here, but that would also have something to do with it. Figure out for your area what seems to work. It's probably going to be for North and Central Florida. Well, I think I've got a slide that shows this. So I was going to say twice a week for St. Augustine grass in the summer. The water management district, St. John's, for example, lets you irrigate once a week during the winter months and twice a week during summer, if I said winter there. But once a week during the winter, and I think that's too much. I think for much of North Florida, much of the Gainesville area, you can go every 2 to 3 weeks without irrigation. Maybe not so much this past month because it has been so hot. Oops, back up here. People can be told, you can water those hot spots. You can drag a hose out there. Unless there's some local ordinance that would restrict that. I don't know of any, but there might be. But you can always do that. Some landscapes just have those hot spots, and they try, they think, well, I've got to run the whole irrigation system. No, just do that one spot there. Make sure that your heads are working. I mean, number one, this is a very bad design. But if you've got a design like this, maybe you're consulting with someone who has a shopping center complex or something. Think about some micro irrigation or something, but we're just wasting a lot of water here. And conversely, we don't want to water past the point of runoff because, again, that just wastes water. But a lot of times I think it's the irrigation. The heads get out of whack, they get run over. And how much to water? 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. That does not vary. Only the frequency of irrigation is going to vary. Ideally, we'd say, when the turf shows symptoms of wilt is when you'd want to irrigate, but most people, once they get that irrigation system set, they don't want to go back and change it because they're going to jinx something for sure. And when we do those short, frequent irrigations, like you've probably scratched your head over, what happens is all of the water stays right in these top couple inches of soil, and that's where the roots stay. So you don't get as deep a root system as when you irrigate for longer, that 3/4 of an inch, for example, and less frequently, once a week, maybe every second or third week in the winter, and you'll wind up with a deeper root system, and that's going to be the much stronger turfgrass system. Again, check those systems every once in a while. People often don't know that they're wasting water, that they've got those gully washers going on there because the irrigation system runs before they get up. So you've just got to, kind of check those every once in a while. Calibrate your systems, teach people how to do a catch can test, and remember that a lot of times, we all know this, but your clients may not think of it. When a home is new, the landscape plants might be a foot tall, and the irrigation heads might be behind some landscape plants. And fast forward 7 or 8 years, and maybe those landscape plants are now 7 feet tall, and the irrigation system is hitting the backside of those bushes instead of the lawn on the other side. So, sometimes those brown spots in the lawn that people want you to take a look at are not always caused by insects or some other type of pest. They could be caused by abiotic stresses, such as incorrect irrigation. Mowing quite often also gets done incorrectly. I think it's somewhere when you cross into the Florida state line, you cross that line, there must be signs flashing that say keep your mower set at 2 inches, no higher than 2.5. Everything will be great, but we don't want to mow at incorrect heights, and for St. Augustine grass, of course, that is too low. And just like we saw with the irrigation, you can influence the depth of your roots by how you mow. When you mow low, the grass will put all of its energy into regrowing the shoot system, and that is going to be at the expense of the root system. And so you'll have this type scenario. When you mow higher, both systems can grow in harmony, and so higher mowing height, deeper root system. So here are our mowing heights for the standard St. Augustine's, again, Floritan, Bitter Blue, Classic, and all the others that we could lump into there too. 3.5 to 4 inches for the dwarfs, 2 to 2.5 inches. Bahia grass, 3 to 4. Centipede grass, apparently I didn't know, but now I'm going to go out on a limb and say 1 inch to 1.5 inches. And zoysia grass, about 2. Some of the recommendations that you might see in some of our pubs may say up to 2.5. Under certain circumstances, you could do 2.5, but it does pretty well at 2. You'll see some of the grower recommendations say 1.5 inches. I get a little nervous with 1.5 inches, especially in landscapes, because it's never a flat, even surface, and so you could potentially get some scalping if you're down that low. Of course, we only want to remove 1/3 of the leaf blade at any one time. That's pretty much standard. Mower blades should be sharpened. We don't think about that. Don't mow wet grass. That's kind of a safety thing. And commercial mowers really should be washed off between properties. We're never going to see that, but it is so easy to transport fungal pathogens and weeds around to the next yard you go to, or even if you've got an area in a yard that looks like it might be large patch or a weed patch, mow it last, otherwise, or wash the mower off. Otherwise, you're just going to be transporting and compounding that problem all over the yard. And one other thing that I always like to make sure that residents are reminded of is do not mow, whether it's a riding mower or a push mower, in sandals or flip-flops. Wear sturdy shoes, please. Farm accidents happen all the time, and that's an urban farm accident. Okay, so that's what I've got here. I think a lot of you know how to reach me, LETR@UFL. Number of websites here that you can look at. I think there may be a few more that I don't even have on here. And Wendy, I don't know if I have time for questions or not, or if anybody wanted to chat.
Yeah, Lori, you have a couple questions.
I do. Okay.
Deanne asked about, what about Bermuda grass in Central Florida?
Okay. So what type of Bermuda grass? Would this be celebration, which is it's a hybrid Bermuda grass, like some of the golf and sports Bermudas are, but it's more suitable for landscapes. It can be mowed a little higher. It can be mowed with a rotary mower versus a reel. It won't do as well with a rotary mower. It won't look as nice. But it is, again, like we talked about with St. Aug and zoysia, well acclimated to conditions throughout pretty much of Florida. Now, there are other cultivars in the hybrids When you talk about other cultivars, you're talking about, again, the golf course types. We don't recommend those for homeowners unless you have a landscape company or something. And then you have the course types, which are often seeded. And, you know, can you picture having a native wild Bermuda coming up in a St. Augustine grass lawn? They're going to look about as good as that Bermuda, that wild Bermuda.
So the quality, it may be a cheap option, but the quality really isn't very good.
Unless you're talking about celebration, and that's good. It tolerates shade better than most other Bermuda grasses, but Bermuda grass shade tolerance is pretty nominal anyway, so that might be a problem.
And then the next question is from Mary Ann LaRosa. She says that her zoysia was overrun by crabgrass last year. The lawn service was able to kill the crabgrass, but now she's got dead long leggy remains of the crabgrass on top. Do I have to dig up the roots because they're always very deep and almost impossible to dig up?
Yes, they are. That's why we call crabgrass such a bad weed. So interesting that you have jammer. That is the second most widely used and grown zoysia grass in the state, but the acreage in sod production and lawns is up, and just, I mean, it's minimal compared to the Empire zoysia. So I hope that's doing well for you. So I would definitely pull up as much of that as you can, because it does have a good underground root and rhizome system. And if you leave it, it will certainly continue to pop back up. And then you've got, you know, the potential for having both vegetative parts in the soil, as well as if it produces any seed, then you've got more seed in the soil bank. So that can be problematic.
Okay. Adam said that remember to show the 3 questions that they need at the end so they can show their coordinator. So you have to share your screen again, Lori.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. Let me get that up. Okay, share screen. Okay, are you seeing that slide again?
Not yet. There it is. Yeah, okay. Yeah. And then hit next and it'll be there.
Yep, there we go.
Okay, and then I think you've got another. Someone's asking about dollar weed in St. Augustine. It sounds like maybe I need to have a weed webinar, and that'll be easy enough to do. I know a guy who can do that.
Yeah. So this is let's see. So you're asking. We have wild Bermuda, and I've just been told to add Bermuda sod. I would like to intermix zoysia. The problem with that is if you get Bermuda sod and it's, let's say it's celebration, and you try mixing that with the zoysia, I mean, the mowing height would be about the same, but some of the other cultural questions or practices might be different. The amount of fertilizer is probably going to be less for the zoysia. It just might be problematic to try and do that. I mean, I'm not promoting a monoculture, but sometimes it's easier to take care of one grass than multiples. And then dollar weed and St. Augustine grass, yeah, good luck. It's just going to keep reappearing. There's not a lot you can use. You may be able to find some options if you go to like, you know, one of the more commercial retail outlets. That may work, but it's going to be tough.
All right, Lori, do you want to read the questions out?
Okay. So what grass, species, and cultivar, if you can, is the best choice for a shady site in a lawn? And next is, what is the maximum amount of nitrogen fertilizer to apply at any one time? Any single application event, that means. And how much irrigation water should be applied at each irrigation event? Every time you irrigate. And what's the correct mowing height for Floratam St. Augustine grass?
Good questions, Lori.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, Lori, thank you so much for being with us today. We had a really great participation. I think everybody got really good information, so it was definitely worth it. So I hope that you'll come back and do another webinar for us again.
Absolutely, and thanks for the opportunity to reach so many Master Gardeners at a time. It's been fun.
Awesome. Thanks. Lori. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.